Images from the era that show at first glance nothing remarkable. Trees, pathways, people standing among what appears to be dense, layered vegetation. Not wild, not agricultural in the way we understand that word, but something in between, something deliberate, something designed. I wasn't looking for food forests. I wasn't looking for erased civilizations or lost agricultural systems that may have fed entire continents without a single plough. I was looking for something else entirely, an old photograph, a single frame, and I stumbled into a question that I still cannot fully answer. The photograph was unremarkable. That's what made it remarkable. At first glance, nothing seems out of place until you linger. Until you start asking what exactly you are looking at. Because the vegetation in that image doesn't behave the way vegetation is supposed to behave in the period from which the photograph supposedly originates. The layering is wrong. The density is wrong. The arrangement, the way certain plants appear to cascade beneath the canopy of others, the way certain low-growing species ring the base of older trees, in patterns that repeat, that persist from the left edge of the frame to the right, doesn't look accidental, doesn't look wild, it looks managed. And the people in the foreground, they're not farming, they're not ploughing, they're not carrying tools, they appear to be walking through, moving through the landscape as though it is a place they know, a place they understand, a place that provides without effort, without season, without the desperate annual gamble of monoculture agriculture that we have always been told was the only way large populations could feed themselves. I kept the photograph, and then I found more, and more, and more. The further I dug, the less the official story held together. Let me start with what a food forest actually is, because the modern framing of this concept, the way it gets presented to us today as some novel permaculture innovation, some radical new idea emerging from progressive gardening circles, is, I would argue, itself a kind of misdirection. Subtle, but deliberate. A food forest is a multi-layered growing system. Canopy trees, sub-canopy, shrub layer, herbaceous layer, ground cover, root vegetables, climbers, each layer performing a function, each feeding and being fed by the others. It is not a garden. It is not a farm. It is something older than both, something that requires not months but decades of accumulated knowledge to establish, to maintain, to read. And here's what the academic literature will quietly acknowledge. If you press it, multi-layer food forest systems require no ploughing, no irrigation infrastructure in temperate climates, no seasonal replanting. Once established, truly established, they produce abundantly, continuously, with minimal human intervention. This prompts a straightforward yet vital question. If such a system could feed large numbers of people with relatively little ongoing labour, why would any civilization abandon it? Why would any civilization replace it with the vastly more labour-intensive monoculture agriculture that dominates our world today? The sanctioned explanation is progress. The sanctioned explanation is always progress. But progress toward what exactly? More work, more dependency on seasonal cycles, more vulnerability to single crop failures? The logic, when you examine it honestly, does not hold. The further I dug, the more the accepted narrative began to give way. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the manner of old wood under quiet pressure. Slowly, then completely. One of many forgotten photographs, a tree line of unusual density, ancient growth canopy, the suggestion of undergrowth that bears fruit. A frame that wasn't meant to stand out among the survey images around it. On the border between Poland and Belarus sits Białowieża Forest, one of the last and largest remaining fragments of primeval European lowland forest. UNESCO World Heritage Site. Strictly protected. Large sections entirely off-limits to the public. Researchers require special permissions. Journalists require permissions. Even within the areas that are technically accessible, movement is controlled, monitored, and restricted. The official explanation is conservation, preserving old-growth ecosystem, protecting the European bison. These are not unreasonable things to say, and yet Biała Wieża contains something that conservation literature tends to mention only in passing, almost apologetically: wild apple trees, wild pear trees, wild cherry, hazel, elder, sorbus, cornelian cherry, species that produce edible fruit, species that, in the density and distribution observed within this forest, require a more than casual explanation. Wild fruit trees do not typically cluster in the ratios observed here. They do not typically coexist in this particular layered arrangement without some organizing principle. Botanists have noted quietly in papers that do not receive wide circulation that certain sections of Biała Wieża display vegetation patterns consistent with what you might call managed diversity. Not managed recently, managed historically, and then left to run. Left to run or left to be forgotten. And this is the most peculiar part. The sections with the most anomalous vegetation patterns are, almost without exception, the sections with the most restricted access. I'm not telling you that's deliberate. I'm asking you why that would be the case. I'm asking you to sit with that question. Photographs of the period showing ancient woodland, the canopy impossibly thick, the floor beneath it patterned with what might be deliberately spaced growth, an image that rewards a second look. Everyone knows Sherwood Forest. The story, Robin Hood, outlaws, a forest belonging in some romantic sense to common people dispossessed by a ruling order. It is one of the most potent mythological landscapes in the English-speaking world. What is less discussed is the Forest of Dean, or the New Forest, or Epping, or the dozens of ancient woodland designations scattered across Britain, each protected, each with restricted zones, each with histories that, if you trace them back carefully enough, reveals something interesting. These forests were not always simply forests. They were, in many cases, what the historical record calls forest law territories, lands held under specific legal frameworks that restricted common access. The official history presents this as aristocratic land grab, wealthy nobles seizing hunting grounds. And yes, that happened. I'm not disputing that it happened, but here's the anomaly that the official framing consistently glosses over: the specific species compositions of these legally protected forests. The New Forest contains ancient yew, crabapple, wild service tree, a species so consistently associated with ancient woodland management that ecologists use its presence as a marker of historical land use. Hawthorn, blackthorn, sloe, crab, wild plum. These are not simply trees. These are, in combination, a food system. A perennial, self-sustaining food system capable of supporting human populations through the kinds of seasonal gaps that winter would otherwise make lethal. Not a hunting ground, not a timber reserve, not an aristocratic playground, a larder, possibly an immense landscape-scale larder. Protected, but protected from whom and why? The sanctioned explanation gives way at this point, because if these forests were simply private hunting grounds, why does the species composition consistently skew toward food-bearing varieties? Deer can eat grass. Deer don't require crab-apple density. Something else was being protected, or something else was being concealed. Images from the era showing dense vegetation in a configuration that seems too regular for wilderness, too wild for agriculture. Something in between. Something without a clean name in our current vocabulary. What I'm about to describe is the moment this investigation became impossible for me to set aside. Because up to this point you could argue regional variation, you could argue local history, you could argue that I was reading too much into botanical surveys and land use records from a specific corner of the world, and then the pattern resurfaces with disturbing exactness on the other side of the planet. The Daintree rainforest in northeastern Australia, over 1,000 square kilometres of protected tropical rainforest, largest continuous tropical rainforest on the continent, UNESCO listed, access in significant portions restricted, controlled, managed through permit systems and indigenous custodianship designations that effectively limit what researchers and the public are permitted to observe. The Daintree contains species that appear, on the surface, to be entirely consistent with a wild tropical rainforest, except that botanists working within it, and here I would encourage you to read the primary literature carefully, not the summaries, the actual papers, have noted what they describe as unusual clustering of economically valuable species. Fruit-bearing palms, nut-producing trees, species with edible roots, species with medicinal and nutritional properties, distributed in patterns that correlate poorly with standard models of seed dispersal and forest succession. Not randomly distributed, clustered, layered, accessible. The indigenous custodians of this forest describe relationships with specific plants that extend back in ways that standard archaeological chronology struggles to accommodate. They describe knowledge systems, not just knowledge of individual plants, but knowledge of plant communities, of how to read a forest as an integrated food system. Knowledge that is frankly too sophisticated to have developed in the absence of long sustained intentional engagement with this landscape. Is that engagement evidence of an older cultivated system? I won't tell you that. I'm asking whether that's a question worth pursuing. I'm asking why it isn't being pursued more aggressively, and this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because in the Amazon basin, the same question is being asked, and the answers emerging are even more difficult to incorporate into the standard narrative. A surviving print from the time, a cleared section revealing something beneath the canopy, layered vegetation, the hint of deliberate arrangement in the spacing of the visible trees. The image raises questions that its caption does not answer. The Amazon is supposed to be wild. That is a foundational premise of how we understand the Americas before European contact, vast, pristine wilderness, lightly inhabited by small nomadic or semi-nomadic populations. This premise has been collapsing quietly for decades. Terra preta, dark earth. Soil of extraordinary fertility distributed across vast sections of the Amazon basin in patterns that are inconsistent with natural geological processes. Soil created by human beings. Soil engineered, and I use that word carefully because engineering implies not improvisation but design, not accident but intention, to sustain food production across enormous areas for extended periods. Researchers like Anna Roosevelt, Clark Erickson, and more recently Patrick Roberts have been carefully, methodically, and often quietly rewriting what we know about pre-contact Amazonian civilizations. What emerges is not the familiar picture of isolated forest dwellers living lightly on the land. What emerges is something else entirely. Dense settlements, sophisticated infrastructure, and, critically, managed forest landscapes that produced food at a scale that would require us to fundamentally reconsider what was there before it disappeared. And that's precisely where the Amazon becomes impossible to dismiss. Because the FUNAI protected territories, the officially designated restricted zones within the Brazilian Amazon, ostensibly maintained to protect uncontacted indigenous communities, contain sections of forest that botanical surveys describe in terms strikingly similar to what I've described in Biała Wieża. Multi-species edible plant clustering, unusual distribution of fruit-bearing trees, canopy structures that, in the words of one survey report, suggest prior human modification. Suggest, not confirm. Suggest. I'm not suggesting those territories shouldn't be protected. I want to be clear about that. The protection of those communities is not in question here. What I'm asking, what I can't stop asking, is whether the protection has the additional, perhaps unintended, perhaps not unintended effect of limiting access to something that predates those communities, something much older, something that would raise questions if examined too closely. The further I went, the more the map filled in. Photographs from the period depicting what appears to be the same landscape in different light. The same layered canopy, the same ambiguous spacing, the same cultivated wildness, though the images are labelled as being from entirely different regions. an image that wasn't meant to stand out. Here is where I need you to think carefully, because what I'm about to lay out is not a claim. It is a pattern, and patterns require explanation. If the forests I've described, Białowieża in Eastern Europe, the New Forest and Forest of Dean in Britain, Daintree in Australia, the restricted zones of the Amazon, the old growth sections of the Tongass in Alaska, the protected interiors of the Congo Basin, the restricted ancient woodlands of the Valdivian temperate rainforest in Chile, if these landscapes share characteristics consistent with managed food forest systems, and if each of them has, in the historical record, a moment where access becomes restricted, where documentation becomes scarce, where the landscape transitions from something people interacted with to something people are told to observe from a distance, then we have a coordination problem. Because these transitions did not happen simultaneously through communication. They did not emerge from a single policy. They were not the product of a single administration or a single legal framework. They happened across hemispheres, across centuries as conventionally dated, across cultures that are supposed to have had no meaningful contact with one another. And yet, the pattern is the same. Everywhere, restriction of access, classification of the landscape as wilderness, as primeval, as untouched, even when the botanical evidence suggests the opposite. And then quietly, the imposition of permitting systems, heritage designations, conservation frameworks, all of which have the practical effect of preventing ordinary people from examining these places too closely. Not the reason, not the timing, not the conditions were identical. And yet the outcome was. How? The sanctioned explanation? And there isn't really a satisfying sanctioned explanation for this, which is itself telling, would involve coincidence, would involve independent development, would involve the suggestion that multiple civilizations on multiple continents coincidentally decided to fence off their most productive food-bearing landscapes and relabel them as wilderness. Does that satisfy you? It didn't satisfy me. One of many forgotten photographs, a landscape in the process of change, perhaps, though change of what kind is unclear. At first glance, nothing seems out of place, but something has already happened here. Something is already gone. There is a period, and I am going to be deliberately vague about the dating, because the dating is precisely what's in dispute, and I don't want the specifics of a calendar to distract from the structural observation. There is a period in the historical record where something changes, worldwide, and changes without adequate documentation of the transition. Before this period, scattered but consistent references, in local histories, in folklore, in agricultural texts, in travellers' accounts, in the kinds of sources that are considered too minor to include in mainstream historical synthesis, references to forests that fed people, that were known by local communities to feed people, that were, in some cases, explicitly described as communal food resources, common land in its truest sense. After this period, wilderness, heritage, the language of conservation, the assumption of primeval untouched nature, the reframing of these same landscapes as things to be observed, preserved, kept at arm's length from the people who once, apparently, walked through them and ate from them. The silence was overwhelming when I started looking for documentation of this transition. Not because there was no documentation, there are records, fragmentary and inconsistent, but because the documentation that exists is strangely incurious about what was lost. Tax records that stop enumerating yield, survey maps that reclassify productive land as waste, management records that simply end, not transferred, not summarized, not referenced in subsequent documents as having been superseded, just type end. Sherwood Forest documented management records show this kind of gap. The ancient woodlands of England more broadly show it. The Białowieża records, insofar as accessible, show it. The land use records around the Amazon's most anomalous terra preta sites show something similar. A before and after, a between that has been somehow lost or removed or never committed to a form that survived. And this is the most peculiar part. In each case, when I followed the thread of what came after the gap, I found the same institutional move. The landscape gets classified, gets protected, gets enclosed within a framework that limits investigation while publicly framing that limitation as stewardship. Stewardship of what, exactly? Wilderness doesn't need stewardship. Wilderness is, by definition, capable of sustaining itself. What gets stewarded, what has historically required stewardship, is a managed system, a cultivated system, a system with rules and knowledge embedded in it that, if the stewardship failed, would collapse, unless the stewardship isn't about maintaining the system, unless it's about maintaining the secret of the system. I'm not telling you that's what's happening. I'm asking, which interpretation fits the evidence more cleanly? Images from the era showing figures at the edge of a forest not entering, positioned as observers rather than participants. The image hints at something changed in the relationship between these people and this landscape, possibly a restriction, though the context is never explained. Let's talk about what would be lost if a worldwide managed food forest network were erased. Not the food, though the food alone represents something staggering to contemplate, but the knowledge. The embedded, accumulated, generational knowledge of how to read these systems, how to maintain them, how to harvest them without diminishing them, how to expand them, how to adapt them. This kind of knowledge doesn't live in books. It never has. It lives in practice, in transmission, in the repeated physical act of walking through a forest and knowing, not thinking, knowing what each plant is, what it needs, what it offers, when to take from it and when to leave it alone. Once that transmission breaks, once a generation grows up believing these landscapes are wilderness, believing they have no relationship to the trees around them, believing that food comes from farms and markets and not from the land beneath their feet, the knowledge doesn't just become inaccessible. It ceases to exist. It is functionally erased, not by burning books, but by breaking the chain of people who carried it. And here's what I find most haunting. Not the most dramatic aspect of this investigation. Not the most inflammatory, but the most quietly devastating. We have ethnobotanical records from dozens of indigenous communities worldwide, communities studied and documented before and after their displacement from traditional lands, that describe relationships with forest food systems of extraordinary sophistication. Relationships that, in case after case, do not match the primitive hunter-gatherer framing that was applied to these communities by the researchers doing the documenting. The San people of southern Africa, the Hadza of Tanzania, the various forest-dwelling communities of the Congo Basin, the Aboriginal communities of the Daintree, the Kayapo of the Amazon, whose territory management, when finally studied with appropriate seriousness in the late 20th century, turned out to involve deliberate transplantation of food species across hundreds of kilometers of forest. An active, systematic, large-scale food forest management practice that had been operating invisibly to outside observers the entire time. Not primitive, not simple, not the random expression of people living close to nature. Something far more considered, far more architectural, something that looks, the further you examine it, less like a cultural practice that developed organically, and more like the residual maintenance of an older, larger system. A system whose full extent these communities perhaps no longer fully understand themselves, because the knowledge too was broken, too was fragmented, too was passed down imperfectly through a rupture that, and here I want to be very precise, the standard historical timeline does not adequately account for. The evidence points to something far more expansive than any single civilization's agricultural practice. Something that, if it existed, would rewrite not just our history, but our understanding of what human beings are capable of organizing, and what human beings have lost. A sequence of images, different environments, different densities, different textures, but something connecting them that the eye registers before the mind can name it. The same quality of controlled wildness, the same studied inaccessibility, one of many forgotten photographs preserved without adequate explanation. I want to spend some time with the specific geography of restriction, because when you map the locations of worldwide significant protected forests against the botanical data on edible species density, against the anthropological data on traditional food knowledge, against the fragmentary historical record suggesting prior extensive human land use, the map that results is not random. The Tongass National Forest in southeastern Alaska, the largest national forest in the United States, over 16 million acres, extensive wilderness designation, research access strictly managed, contains Sitka spruce, western hemlock, yes, but also extensive berry systems, Devil's Club, whose medicinal and nutritional properties were extensively known to indigenous communities, beech strawberry, various currant species, high bush cranberry, distributed across a landscape that, in its totality, would have provided substantial caloric support for far larger populations than the archaeological record currently acknowledges, the Black Forest of Germany. The name itself a kind of misdirection. It is not simply dark because of its conifers. It contains ancient fruit tree populations, cherries, pears, the kind of genetic diversity in its fruit populations that speaks to centuries of intentional cultivation. And areas within it, quiet, legally protected, technically accessible, but practically obscure, that nobody seems particularly eager to study systematically. The Valdivian temperate rainforest of southern Chile and Argentina, one of the rarest forest types on Earth, contains the monkey puzzle tree, Araucaria araucana, whose seeds, the piñones, were historically a dietary staple providing more caloric density than wheat per unit of land. This forest is legally protected in ways that make systematic interior study extremely difficult. The communities that historically manage the Araucaria are increasingly restricted from traditional harvesting practices within the protected zones, a paradox the conservation literature tends to discuss in carefully measured bureaucratic language. The Congo Basin, second largest tropical rainforest on Earth, contains more edible plant species than almost any comparable ecosystem on the planet. Subject to one of the world's most complex patchworks of protected area legislation, national park designations and research access restrictions. Interior sections studied by relatively few independent researchers. The sections that have been studied reveal again and again patterns of edible species distribution consistent with historical human management. Each of these places, each of them protected, each of them restricted, each of them containing something. An unusual density of productive species, an anomalous distribution pattern, a residual organization that speaks to intention that doesn't fit cleanly into the wilderness narrative applied to them. And that's precisely where the coincidence argument becomes impossible to sustain, because the restriction and the anomaly consistently appear together. Not sometimes, not usually, consistently. I'm not drawing a conclusion, I'm following a pattern, an image that wasn't meant to stand out, a view across open ground toward a dense tree line. Nothing dramatic, nothing obviously significant, but at the edge of the frame, almost out of range, something that might be a pathway, worn smooth, too regular. The image hints at use, at repeated passage, at a relationship with this landscape that the official description of the site does not mention. Here is the thing about absence. It is the hardest kind of evidence to see. It requires you to notice not what's there, but what should be there and isn't. Where are the records of transition? If these forests move from managed to wild, from productive to protected, from communal food resource to restricted heritage site, where is the documentation of that transition? Not the documentation of the protected status. That exists abundantly. The documentation of what came before, the yield records, the harvest calendars, the management guides, the knowledge transfer, where did that go? Not lost, not misfiled, not destroyed in fires, floods, wars, though all of those explanations get invoked, and invoked conveniently, for whichever specific gap you're asking about. But worldwide, simultaneously, across cultures, across continents, across language groups that have no recorded history of coordination. The silence was overwhelming. And silence of this kind, this organized, this complete, this geographically distributed, is not accident. Or, if it is accident, what kind of accident operates at this scale? This prompts a straightforward yet vital question that I think deserves more than a rhetorical acknowledgement. If you wanted to erase a world-spanning food system, not the physical infrastructure, which is largely self-maintaining and therefore nearly impossible to physically destroy, but the knowledge of the system, the relationship to the system, the understanding that the system existed, how would you do it? You wouldn't burn the forests. You can't. Too large, too resilient, you would do exactly what appears to have been done. You would enclose them. You would reclassify them. You would make them inaccessible, not dramatically, not provocatively, but bureaucratically, incrementally, under frameworks that carry the moral weight of conservation and science and heritage. You would break the chain of knowledge transmission by severing the practical relationship between people and place. You would produce a generation, then 2, then 10, that genuinely did not know the forest could feed them, that looked at a food forest and saw only trees, not a conspiracy, not a cabal in a room deciding to do this, maybe something more organic than that, maybe something more structural, a set of incentives, a set of institutions, a set of intellectual frameworks that all coincidentally pointed in the same direction, or maybe not coincidentally. Images from the era that seem at first to show nothing more than trees. At first glance, nothing seems out of place. Until you linger, until you count the species, until you look at the spacing, until you ask why this particular collection of food-bearing plants is here, in this particular arrangement, in this particular location, where no official history suggests it has any right to be. I want to close with something that isn't an answer, because I don't have an answer, and I'm suspicious at this point in the investigation of anyone who claims to. I want to close with a question. Several questions. If a civilization, praik, or something functioning as a civilization, some organizing principle operating at a world-spanning scale, had developed a food system based not on cleared fields and annual crops, but on perennial, layered, managed forest systems, what would the evidence of that system look like after several hundred years of neglect and deliberate reclassification? It would look exactly like what we find in Białowieża, in the New Forest, in the Daintree, in the protected interior of the Congo Basin, in the restricted zones of the Tongass, in the carefully fenced Araucaria forests of Patagonia, anomalous species clustering, unusual productive diversity, distribution patterns inconsistent with unmanaged succession, residual organization without organizational record. And here is the question that I cannot shake, the one that has followed me through every archive and every survey and every carefully worded conservation report. If these forests were simply wild, if they were, as the official frameworks insist, primeval, untouched, pristine, why do they need to be protected? Wild ecosystems that have never known human management do not need protection from human management. They are simply wild. They would recover from any incursion, they would revert. But a managed system, a cultivated system, a food forest of enormous complexity and productivity that someone at some point spent centuries or millennia establishing, that system, if left without the knowledge needed to maintain it, will change, will shift, will slowly shed its productive character as the organized layer relationships drift back toward local equilibrium. What we are protecting in some of these places may not be wilderness, may be the last remnant of something we do not have adequate words for anymore. A system whose original purpose we have forgotten, a system whose managers we have lost, a system that is slowly losing the form its creators gave it, and that we are, with all the institutional weight of conservation law and UNESCO designations and national heritage frameworks, unwittingly watching dissolve, not preserving it, witnessing its slow disappearance, calling that witnessing protection. The trees are still there. In Białowieża, the ancient hazel still fruits in autumn in densities that no ecological model of unmanaged forest succession fully explains. In the New Forest, the wild service tree still marks the boundaries of something that predates the Norman land grab by a margin that the historical record cannot quite accommodate. In the Daintree, the clusters of economic species still occupy the exact configurations that would make sense if someone very long ago put them there. The trees remember even when we don't. And the further I went into this, the more the question changed. It stopped being, what did they erase? That question, I think, has an answer. A food system of worldwide proportions. A perennial, managed, self-sustaining infrastructure of abundance. Something so productive, so well designed, so embedded in the landscape that destroying it physically would have been impossible. The question became, why? What is so threatening about a forest that feeds everyone? What is so dangerous about an abundance that requires no central distribution, no control point, no chokehold through which access can be managed? I think you know the answer to that. I think if you followed this investigation to this point, you've already arrived at it. I'm just not going to say it out loud. The trees will outlast us. Whatever was built in them, whatever knowledge is still running silently in the species relationships and the soil chemistry and the layered canopy architecture of these restricted, protected, inaccessible places, it is still there, waiting for someone to remember how to read it. I wasn't looking for food forests, but I found them. And now I can't stop seeing them. In Białowieża, in the Forest of Dean, in the deep interior of the Amazon, in every restricted ancient woodland where the plants are slightly too well arranged, the species slightly too productively clustered, the distribution slightly too convenient to have arrived there by accident. They are everywhere, they are fenced off, and what's inside the fence is not wilderness. It never was. If this investigation resonates with you, share it with someone who still believes the forest is wild. Ask them to explain the species distribution, ask them to explain the coordination, ask them to explain the silence, because I've been asking for 3 years and I'm still waiting.